Welcome to the Science and Beers podcast with me, Mickey. Talking science and drinking beers with researchers down at the pub. We cover a new topic each episode, so join us with a brew and let's cheers to science. Carolin, thanks for joining me on the Science Beers podcast.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure.
We're sitting here with a Brooklyn
Brewery
IPA, East IPA.
Could
what
be
does
worse.
this taste like?
Like New York, right?
6.9%.
Is it?
It's good.
Oh, heavy, huh?
Indeed. So we're going to drink a couple of these. We're going to talk science.
Yeah.
Carolin, you're an associate professor
Almost, yeah, from I guess next week on. Yes.
at NordCEE, at the Nordic Centre for Earth Evolution,
Yeah.
at the University of Southern Denmark. You're also a chair of Geobiology at D-IAS, the Danish Institute for Advanced Studies. Is that not right?
That's right, yes. They now call it a fellow at D-IAS, not a chair.
You are a fellow.
I'm a fellow. I'm a fellow.
So does that mean you don't get a chair anymore?
I have 2 chairs.
Okay.
I don't know. So, they didn't take my chair. No, but I'm a fellow. They have this. They had a renaming of our titles, and so you can be a professor at the institute. You can be a fellow at D-IAS.
Yeah. What does it involve?
Essentially, D-IAS is it's supposed to be some sort of melting pot of the brightest minds that we have at SDU. And it's very interdisciplinary, and if you're a fellow, you're supposed to basically do brilliant research and blend it together with the other people's research so that we develop ideas that you otherwise would probably not develop because you would be alone and never meet those people, or you would only be within your field, right? And so there is a bunch of very interesting assistant and associate professors and also senior fellows that indeed, you wouldn't meet them necessarily from social science, from history, from all over the place, from health science. And it's, actually you can develop joint ideas. You can actually develop even projects. And we started talking to each other more, and actually we would never meet without D-IAS. So it's nice. I sit my office is besides one of an assistant professor who works on literature, and he's following up tracks in older literature and historical literature, how humans responded to past climate change, and how they basically put that into literature, and how they moved through different countries because they wanted to avoid or follow certain climate tracks, right? And so we had the idea to develop a joint project from this. I would never have met that guy because literature, right?
Yeah, you study biology. You're always going to be in the department for biology.
Yeah, you usually are, right?
Yeah, you talk to people from biology. Your ideas are in biology, so it's.
No, it's very helpful
you talk to
actually.
somebody from literature.
So I found this really a great opportunity, and I like the other fellows that are there. It's a nice thing, It was obviously a bit interrupted to really meet in person, but people are coming back, and you can meet them now again. And we got this nice new building.
Yeah.
You should actually come by. We have a rooftop terrace.
You have a rooftop terrace. You say that could be good for.
It's very important for the meetings.
Yeah.
What? It's summer.
Indeed.
And you need to sit somewhere.
Scientists and beer. Your own field of science, it combines different areas. So biology, chemistry, geology, biogeochemistry.
Yeah, that's how you do it. Right?
But
what else would you do, right?
Before we get into talking about biogeochemistry and climate change, I want to know, how did you get into science? What inspired you?
Well, I think I wanted to be. I didn't quite know what a scientist is as a child because I didn't know anyone who was doing that. But I really liked the ocean, and I wanted to know stuff about it. When I was a child, we lived close to the Mediterranean. We had a house there, and then we went to the water every day. And I didn't have diving classes, so I brought normal classes and looked into the water with them to see what's down there, and I saw all the little animals and the fish and little corals. It's
like a lens with some kind of plastic.
Well, I just essentially took a drinking class in the first place. And when I was 7 or 8, I got proper diving equipment, like snorkeling equipment, from my parents finally, so I could actually, look at it. And I found it so beautiful, and I like most the corals. They're gorgonies in Italy, and they are colorful. And then I learned that they are a symbiosis, which I didn't know what it is then, but my dad tried to explain. So there are algae and there are animals, and they somehow work together. And I became a bit obsessed with this until I was a teenager, and that was kind of, I think, the stepping stone for me to decide that I want to study biology at a point, because I really like to figure out about the ocean. I never worked on corals.
Yeah.
But then, when I studied biology, then I was still, I had this goal, right, to do marine biology, and I went at a point to Kiel, which is the place in Germany where you go if you want to study marine biology or marine biogeochemistry. And there was a guy who became my mentor actually over the years, who's always until now been my mentor, Hermann Bange. He's a greenhouse gas specialist. And he's a chemist by training. And he tries to figure out what builds up methane and nitrous oxide, which are two important greenhouse gases in the ocean, right? And tries to understand those processes and how important this is and how it changes in response to climate change. And I found this so interesting, so I asked him if I could work for him. And he gave me such a student helper job. And I've been working for him then and did my master's with him. And I took this actually as an example, nitrous oxide production, for something that organisms make to warm up the world, right? Because it's one of the strongest greenhouse gases.
Laughing gas.
Yeah, laughing gas. Yeah, Hermann even wrote a paper that's called Laughing Gas, It's Not a Laughing Matter. He did. He has good titles for his papers.
Okay, so let's focus on N2O then. So you're laughing gas.
You know something. Yes. No, it's good.
Yeah, so you said the theory that inspired you during your masters was to try and find if the microbes that were releasing N2O as a normal byproduct of their metabolism, they were making the world a better environment for them to live in.
Yeah, they would kind of self-stabilize in an environment, right? That was an idea. So that's what I always thought. You, as an organism, you would have an interest in shaping your environment in a way that it makes it better suitable for you and your fellows, more or less, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a simplistic thought, and it's discussed a lot, right? People believe it, people don't believe it. It's essentially what's referred to as the Gaian theory. It's that organisms create a habitable environment for themselves and other organisms, and that this is constantly, via feedbacks, optimized and stabilizes in a continuously more stable and conservative frame.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's basically my big question in science, to figure out if this is right or not.
So I think
that's basically driving everything,
Gaian,
more or less.
Gaian theory proposed by James Lovelock.
Mm-hmm.
James Lovelock, and he
You say that funny.
James Lovelock?
Yeah, that sounds super funny. James.
How would you say it?
I don't know. I say James.
James.
Yeah, James.
Yes, James. Yes, James.
No, that's fine. I don't know. I mean, he didn't respond to my calls, so I don't know how he would say his own name.
I heard him talk in a podcast recently.
Yeah, but he is mid-90s now,
exactly,
right?
Yeah. But he was kind of reflecting on his life. And he started off as a chemist, and they were experimenting on mice, and about they were trying to like freeze mice and then bring them back to life again. I can't remember the reason why they were doing that in, I don't know, the 50s
I don't
or
think
60s.
that's a good idea. I don't know.
But so they were using a hot spoon to like heat the heart up first. So they were scalding the
Okay, yeah.
like the science community at the time were using a hot spoon to like heat the heart up first so that the mouse would come back to life. So then he didn't like that. He wanted a more humane way.
That's understandable.
So he invented the microwave.
Okay, how did that go?
He himself, like, well, we heat up our food in the microwave. he invented the microwave, and then
For heating up mice.
And then he invented the electron capture detector.
Yeah, which is big because you measure nitrous oxide with it.
Yeah.
You need a GCECD system.
Yeah.
That's important.
And then so he's able to like measure the atmospheric gas concentration, and then come up with the theory that. Would I be right in saying, in particular, it's the microorganisms that regulate the chemistry of the Earth?
Well, yeah, I mean, that was essentially what was put forward, what was possible through inventing the electron capture detector and doing proper gas measurements, and then you can actually see that organisms largely change the composition of the atmosphere, and in a way that other organisms or themselves can use it again, right? And this comes together again with greenhouse gases, right? If you have organisms moderating this whole system, then you have them taking that up, and then it's not warming up too much, it's not getting too cold.
Oh, the barmaid is asking, do we need a refill?
I guess I'm still good.
Oh, we'll be okay, I'll come in 5 minutes, okay? So for some microorganisms would produce greenhouse gas by one means or another, and then others would consume greenhouse gases and kind of work to keep the Earth in.
Well, that would be one way, and essentially it's also connected to temperature stabilization, right? One of the big issues of organisms is that they tolerate only certain temperatures, and you would want them to, or they would want to thrive in a narrow range of temperatures, essentially. And if they moderate the greenhouse gas abundance in the atmosphere, this directly influences the temperature of the Earth. So that would be fine, right? If you could just do this, you could warm it up, you could cool it down, you could keep it in a balance.
Yes.
And this needs, the more complex the network is of organisms, the more stable you get, because there's only so much overlap. So you evolve a planet that needs very stable conditions, but also the life supports those very stable conditions, which we now have essentially, right? We only have a very narrow temperature range on the whole planet, despite it looks a bit differently, but essentially the average temperatures are quite narrow, around 20 degrees, right? So it's nice and cozy.
Can you talk a little bit about how extraordinary it is that we live on a planet like this?
There's only one.
So
I mean, there is the distance to the sun, which is maybe the biggest constraint to be a planet that can have life or not. You have a couple of planets like Mars right besides the Earth, which are then possibly in the habitable zone still, but just a bit too cold or a bit too warm to really make it work the way that Earth could make it work, because there you see the temperature is essentially important. But also it's a couple of different other parameters, right? You would have to have the right chemical composition, and by some chance or not chance, you would have to have built up an atmosphere in some sense to provide a first protection for this planet. And then you need to start being chemically so abundant and bringing all the chemicals together in one little pond or something to make life. I mean, how can that even happen? It's somewhat not understandable, and it actually isn't explainable, right? So there's something called the eigenparadoxon, which tells you that you can't just have DNA assembled in a certain length unless you have encoded a repair or replication enzyme. But chemically, you can't get as much to encode this enzyme in the first place, so it's actually not explainable how the first bit of DNA could assemble like this. So this is a quite rare thing.
Quite rare.
Yeah, it's quite rare. I'm in the NASA. I made a discovery 2 years ago about a solar system where you have a couple of planets that are also in the right distance to a star. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is something obviously also special. And I'm not quite sure what happened afterwards, because that was a very quick press release, and they were going to look into the atmospheric composition of those planets that were in question for possibly having life. But I didn't hear anything, so it probably failed.
Yeah. Well,
but that would be the way you go, right? You would essentially look at the atmospheric composition, which brings you back to the greenhouse gases. You would look at what is this atmosphere made of. And if you have enough CO2, if you have methane, if you have anything, that deviates from a pure chemical production, you could conclude there's life.
Yes, because in chemistry there's a natural way in which chemicals will interact and degrade.
Sure.
But if there's something deliberately pumping up,
And you can
chemicals,
predict this,
then
right? You can predict from the elemental composition of the planet what you would chemically expect if there is no life, just by, different thermodynamical movements, by diffusions and other things.
Yeah, it would be what, CO2, hydrogen sulfide.
There's probably lots of CO2. There's probably maybe hydrogen sulfide, maybe not. You don't know. But if you, for example, find something like oxygen.
Then
that's quite a point, right? You're making the point that there are some organisms actually making this, and this took long on our Earth to develop this, right?
Oxygen cannot be naturally created with geology and chemistry. This is impossible.
No, not
like
really.
Free oxygen.
Not in amounts, right? Yeah. Maybe in traces, but no. Mm-hmm. So this makes our Earth very special, right?
Yeah.
That we have all this oxygen around here. We all feed on it.
And
so this would be a clear hint, but there are other hints. You don't necessarily need to have life forms making oxygen. You could have a bunch of other life forms making methane, for example.
Yeah. But then with oxygen, it doesn't just provide, say, species like us something to breathe. It created a protective layer from with the ozone to block out the harmful UV rays.
Sure, we are very dependent on this, right? If you look at the ozone hole, that's not a good thing. Obviously, right? It lets through the UV radiation in too high amounts, and that's dangerous. It mutates the DNA and destroys it in the end. So we actually need some sorts of layers to protect something like DNA, a complex molecule. Yeah. So you can't just have no atmosphere. This is not featuring life at all.
Without microorganisms 2.8 billion years ago, with multicellular organisms.
Well, there are other types of atmospheres, right? You could have water vapor is the most common thing in our atmosphere, which actually takes a big part of protecting us. But for more complex life forms, you would need some more, and the ozone layer comes in handy. Mm-hmm. And we know that it comes handy since we made a hole into it. So that was helpful. So there was this guy, Paul Crutzen, a pretty famous chemist. He's the only one who, in environmental science, ever got a Nobel Prize. And he discovered the ozone hole. And he put that forward that actually, it could have gone so much worse. It was by chance that it was discovered, more or less. I mean, he had the idea to it, but it was somewhat by chance, and it was somewhat by chance that he directly understood what caused it. And it was also by chance that we used CFCs.
Just for the listener, it's CFCs that were used as a coolant in refrigerators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. They cause it, but also nitrous oxide contributes to causing it, right? Because it degrades to radicals and then depletes the ozone layer, which is the double function of nitrous oxide. It's a double devil. No, but it's an interesting thing, this whole discovery of the ozone hole, and this idea like how we actually, and there Gaia in a way was criticized by him and by other people afterwards, because we were quite lucky, because when CFCs were invented, you could also have used not a fluoride form but a bromide form, and the depletion of the ozone layer would have been so much faster. So essentially it would be not repairable anymore. So it was just a matter of luck. And it was so close that we didn't destroy all life, just like this. So this whole idea of self-regulation and the organisms will do it if we don't, has its weak points.
The person who invented CFCs might go down in history as one of the most terrible inventors in history. Do you know him?
Yeah, but he didn't know what he was doing.
He didn't know what he was doing,
so
but it wasn't just that. It wasn't just that. So I think his name is Thomas somebody.
Yeah.
And so he whenever the cars were a thing in America about 100 years ago, they made this like kick with the engine, and he discovered if you put lead inside the gas.
That's right, I read it.
Then it stops the kick. So then everybody started to get lead poisoning.
Yeah.
And then he invented CFC coolant for the refrigerator, and he created a hole in the ozone there. Then the poor guy actually got smallpox, and because he was an inventor in inverted commas, he lost the use of his legs, so he made a home pulley system so he could like raise himself up and down again. But
that's not so easy.
That malfunctioned, and he strangled in it, and he died by his own invention.
So this Gaia thing is actually a thing, right?
Gaia theory is a thing. The Earth is a self-regulating system.
So the Earth said, like, no thanks, dude. I kind of read about this at a point, I think.
Yeah.
I was, now that you're saying it, it's actually funny, right? How things sometimes work out.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So back to the Gaia, because I'm fascinated
Yeah.
with this as well. So your point earlier on that perhaps these like simple, in inverted commas, microorganisms were trying to create an environment in which they were more comfortable. That would mean warmer, basically, but not too warm and not too cold.
Yeah,
But-
certain
but
range you
that-
would want, right?
But that would imply some kind of foresight.
Yeah, there you run into a problem, right? But
Yeah.
or I mean, there are two ways to look into that, right? To look at this, there is. I mean, you can go the Darwin way and say like, okay, only this will work because they can only tolerate so much, so there's a selection for it.
Mm-hmm.
Or you believe in some sort of, goal or some sort of thing that organisms strive for, or some foresight. It's hard to decide, right? And it's actually that's one big question. You don't know. You can't say it, right? I mean, of course, selection has a strong case here, and there is some sort of feedbacks, but you can't explain it all. But you can't explain it all the time with only selection. Selection only doesn't work. There are actually nice studies, brilliant studies by different working groups. I guess Tim Lenton would be one of the people who contributed one very essential study where you would have this feedback cycle where evolution creates something, and then it looks like the environment looks if this is doing any good for the system, and then adjusts if necessary. Things die off and you have a re-establishment, and the whole thing goes through approval again, and you basically can't really create anything that doesn't work in line with stabilizing the planet. That's kind of romantic, of course. Still, I mean, you would want to believe it. Mm-hmm. And with this, you wouldn't necessarily need a foresight. But somehow, organisms all would want the same. So it's actually more of an altruistic approach to look at the world, which I obviously like, and then a competitive one, as actually the selection theory, as it was in its origin, would put forward. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess that's where we are. So there are models saying one thing, there are observations saying one thing and the other, so you can make your case whichever way you want, right?
So I think we should get into like defining climate change. You gave a fantastic Science and Beers live talk last year on climate change and climate engineering. So
it was fun.
What is climate change?
That's actually a thing. You wrote this question to me, so I was actually having a think about it, and I did together with my Don? I mean, my Don, my Don Canfield, who is actually one of the really important climate scientists or geobiologists on Earth, right? That you could possibly have. We were like, what's climate change? It's like climate is changing continuously. That's right? Of course. So actually, what is climate change? It is just a natural dynamic of the Earth, you would think. Because climate has been changing since ever. Mm-hmm. And it's been changing along developments of life and was initiated by it, but also by
Did you just say climate
Earth
was
dynamics.
Initiated by life?
No, it was not initiated, but it was rapid climate changes were initiated by life.
Yeah.
So you could ask if climate is...
I love thinking about that there, because it's not just humans, it's life.
No, life generally. I mean, think about the development of like those major things like photosynthesis, and then boom, snowball Earth. I mean, so you had those big moments where you...
I think for the listener, we're just going to have to explain
Yeah, sure. So you had a couple of big inventions in life, like first of all you had life, which changed the complete chemistry of the Earth. And this life was only microbes, and most of the life on the planet is microbes. So, but those microbes, as I said before, like produce greenhouse gases and consume them. They take CO2 out of the atmosphere and make sugars, make biomass, their own bodies out of it, right? So they completely modulate the atmosphere and the temperature on Earth, and this is a big deal. This actually already did a lot to our CO2 records if you look at the deep time development of this. And then you had at a point, certainly late, but this was of course an impressive invention, you had organisms, cyanobacteria, producing oxygen. This didn't happen all of a sudden, it was a slow process, and you had to essentially oxidize all chemicals. They were all reduced, which is a chemical state, right? They had to oxidize all those chemicals, so it took a while until oxygen actually showed up measurably somewhere, and there's this big debate about when this exactly was, and I don't care enough. It was some time at a point, and I agree.
2.5 to 2.8 billion years ago, something
yes,
like that.
and I agree with whatever the experts say on this. It's a big debate, and it's relevant in a sense because this development of oxygen, it comes along with the development of a photosynthesis that is very efficient, and photosynthesis is nothing but really efficiently taking out CO2 of the atmosphere. So you could rapidly cool down the planet. Mm-hmm. And so there is a suspicion that this is actually what happened. And if it gets cold, well, life dies at a point, and this life then that dies, some of them don't die essentially, and they may remember this and have in their genetics somehow the information to avoid that next time. So or maybe not.
The atmosphere is very warm, it's CO2. Photosynthesis is invented by cyanobacteria. All the CO2 comes out, goes into their body mass, and then they release oxygen to replace the CO2 in the atmosphere, and then the Earth there's no greenhouse gases anymore, and the Earth plunges into a snowball Earth.
Well, a snowball Earth essentially comes from something else, but you have certainly a rapid cooling at a point. And then, then you go back and you have this oxygen production, which is another problem. Mm-hmm. Oxygen per se is toxic to DNA. It's so problematic for DNA chemically, right? It degrades, or it forms some sort of compounds, radicals, that are able to degrade the DNA. And with this are not good for life forms. And those life forms that were not equipped for this by chance somehow, or purpose, whatever's your preference, couldn't make it. So it was actually a problem. And it
mass
shifted.
Extinction.
That was the idea of Lynn Margulis, who was the other inventor of the Gaian hypothesis. Though this mass extinction, well, yes and no. It's more that organisms find a place where they still can live, right? So the oxygenation of the planet is a stepwise process, and organisms could retract to environments.
So you have all these happy organisms in the ocean, for example.
Yeah.
They're loving life, and then all of a sudden there's oxygen everywhere.
Well, it's not all of a sudden.
And they're being poised, and then they have to sink down into the dirt and crawl underneath this sand and live
You're exaggerating it a bit, but it's
very
visual. It's very visual. No, you paint a picture nicely. So I'm usually asking in one of my first year lectures, like, is there life without oxygen on the planet? And the kids say no. And obviously there's a lot of life without oxygen on our planet, in our bodies even, right? There's a gigantic mass of microbes living in our intestines that live
we need
happily. Yeah, we absolutely need, otherwise it would look quite stupid. And they live oxygen free, and then we have the deep sea that is anoxic partly, and we have oxygen minimum zones. We have different anoxic habitats on different scales. There are particles that are in the middle oxygen free, and so this is a very common thing. Yeah. So oxygen is not necessarily a preferable substance for life, unless you're a higher animal or something, because then you need it. It doesn't work without.
Yeah. But this was a revolutionary invention anyway.
It's the big deal, right?
It was a big deal. It still is a big deal.
Sure, I mean, there are a couple of the big deals, right? One of them is photosynthesis. The other ones are, I guess, the endosymbiosis.
Also by Lynn Margulis.
Yeah, also discovered by the Lynn Margulis woman, who is a very impressive scientist, who was a very impressive scientist, and she discovered that some bacteria took up other microbes, and those then developed into mitochondria, which is essentially what makes energy in our cells. And other microbes were taken up, cyanobacteria, which made the chloroplasts and allowed for the plants to develop, right? And this is, of course, I mean, that would explain all kind of complex life, so this is very impressive. And there's nothing comparable to this. And obviously people are jealous. That's why they kind of blame her that it wasn't her idea and she wasn't good at all.
I've never heard that accusation.
It's a common thing, especially by jealous senior colleagues who are often male.
Okay.
Who essentially said Lynn Margulis, who often say, you often hear the same sentence, Lynn Margulis had 3 ideas, 2 of them were not hers and 1 of them proved wrong, which I find very disrespectful, because her contribution, is so huge.
That's terrible.
I heard it a lot, and it's always pissing me off. I can't accept this. Her contribution was like incomparably huge. So this should be respected. And I mean, obviously, the evolution of oxygen, but also the endosymbiosis, were the things that completely changed our planet and life on the planet. So.
Yeah. Back to the climate, and so let's say in Earth's 4 billion year history of life, there's been an interaction between microbes that have pushed greenhouse gas levels up, brought them down. It's been very, very warm, it's been very, very cold. Often whenever we see it in, say, the press, we say this is the warmest time on record, that we're currently living in. But the records only go back maximum 800,000 years, But
what they mean is actually the human record, right? If they say like this was the hottest summer, let's say, since record, that means like since 1920.
Yeah, but let's just put it into chronological context.
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
So the Earth has been warmer before, and there's been more carbon dioxide.
Sure, it was like. 4 to 5 times as much in Earth history, but also the Earth was completely different. One, right? Life wasn't that complex. We didn't have any higher animals, anything like you see now. So it was a completely different system. The system was to evolve to what we are now, and like this makes actually the case, right? The system had to stabilize to allow for those higher life forms, and those higher life forms backwards put a feedback into it to stabilize it even more. The higher plants are more temperature sensitive than bacteria are. So, but they now take up a lot of the carbon dioxide. So this creates some sort of feedback loop where actually a certain temperature is needed to stabilize the CO2 content, stabilizing it even more all the time. So if you go back in Earth history, sure, you had it warmer, you had more CO2, you had a couple of different other constraints, the oceans were chemically different and so on. But the difference is now that actually the life which we have right now on Earth cannot tolerate this. It's not made for it. It's not made for a rapid change in temperature or CO2. It's not made for it. It's not made for it.
And this is the key. It's the speed of change.
It's the speed of change, and it's also the complexity of life that we have on the planet, the diversity in a sense. Like if I say complexity, I mean it in a sense of diversity, like how many species we have, but also in the sense of how difficult those organisms are constructed, right? So we are quite difficult animals, right? We have a lot of different tissues that have very specific requirements, and so do many higher life forms have that. And we can't take this rapid change. If it's like 10 degrees warmer, animals start to die, and we see this, right? Animals start to die. We have a species loss, which is fairly high. Plants start to die, and this is problematic even more so than animals because they actually moderate actively the climate even more. So if we lose plant species, if we lose parts of the carbon dioxide stock in plants like the Amazon forest, the rainforests, that is a problem. We release too much CO2 to the air, we don't fix enough. So it gets increasingly warmer, and you can create a runaway effect with this. When increasing the temperature more and more, you release the methane, which is stored in the permafrost, in the ice shells, on the Arctic and Antarctic. This is then warming it up even more, and you can't easily go back to it. Because if you kill the species that moderate now the climate, it takes forever to re-evolve them. That's a problem. So you would lose some biodiversity, so the higher life forms would possibly not be able to tolerate a rapid climate change. The lower life forms may. So the planet per se and life per se would probably not get lost in that sense. But you would have a readjustment of species, right? Of species diversity and of species per se, which would mean possibly the loss of humans and the loss of some other species. This would be in line totally with this idea that Tim Lenton put forward, right? With this ever-adjusting feedback cycle that you have evolution creating something, and if it doesn't stabilize, it gets killed off by evolution. So but it's kind of depressing if you're a human because you're the one destabilizing, right?
So I want to put this here. I just based on what you just said there. Let's say whenever it was just microorganisms, the fluctuations in temperature were humongous. And then as, say, organisms became more complex and diversity grew, the fluctuations became less and less and less. And that's where we're at today, because every single species plays a role in keeping the Goldilocks zone right here.
We have this huge diversity who
and
does that together, and that's a very wonderful situation, right?
Yeah.
But if you look at the CO2 record over ancient times, right, you know this picture quite well. You see all those big ups and downs and ups and downs. And then you see it narrowing to a very small value as we have actually now. It's actually small. In the context of Earth history, right? And then you keep the fluctuations, the up and down kind of low. It's all narrow. But now you have this rapid increase, and life as we know it only evolved in this short time where you had it relatively stable. So life is possibly not able to deal with it if it's different than this. And now you have this rapid increase over a very short time frame. And this increase could go on and cause runaway effects that multiply it. So this would be problematic because this life is not evolved like this. It's not evolved to deal with it. Though, of course, if we believe in this whole readjustment and selection for the stabilization, then we are humans. We did something to destabilize. But we are actually born with a brain, so we may actually hold some tools in our hands to actually stabilize it again and to actively now do something about it, and I find this a wonderful thought.
How can we do that?
How can we do that,
How
right?
can we do that?
I mean, there's a bunch of technologies proposed to actively capture CO2 from the atmosphere. There are different disciplines that do it with different things, like there's filters, there are power plants that basically do a reverse thing. There are all kinds of plant more trees approaches, but what has actually been shown now is that we really need to create a CO2 sink. So we can't just not produce more, we really need to create something called a negative emission, so we need to suck up the CO2 again. And well, as I said, there's this so-called carbon capture and storage technology, which is basically some sort of way to filter out CO2 directly from the atmosphere and store it, for example, underneath this deep sea. There are some methods, and those are the methods that I'm interested in, which are in line with an earlier Earth model, which basically enable those CO2 sinks again that we knew over Earth history, where we had a lot of algae, for example, taking up CO2 extremely by having an optimal pH value, for example, in their surrounding, and by being fed with the right nutrients, so they just biologically suck up CO2, and when they die they export it to the deep sea. That's an option too. There are all kinds of approaches.
Export, you mean buried?
They
so
sink down
decomposed.
essentially. They sink down, and what they become is they become fossils. They become fossilized, right? And then they possibly turn into oil, which we then happily pump up again and burn.
In 100 million
well, we possibly shouldn't do that anymore. But so there are different angles that you can take on depending on the discipline you're from. Essentially, you've got to start with educating humans and with decreasing our need to produce all the time more, consume so much, and then dispose it. This is our general problem. But from my side, as an ocean scientist, as an oceanographer, I was fascinated by this idea to make the ocean take up more CO2, because it has a natural capacity to do this chemically, but also biologically. And you can enhance this capacity by basically imitating the ancient oceans, the deep time oceans, by fertilizing them in a sense, or changing their pH values. And this is what I'm trying right now, together with colleagues all over the world, because there are lots of projects now popping up, and we're collaborating with all the different types of and all the different oceans, and hope to come up with proper strategies for all over the world, because ecosystems are different, right?
I'd love for you to elaborate.
So what you can do, I'm in the ocean, so you have CO2 in the atmosphere. CO2 just diffuses into water. You know it like from essentially a soda or something, where you have CO2 in, right?
So we get
It
our
dissolves
bubbles
nicely.
in this delicious
Yeah, I
Dublin
mean the
IPA.
beer has a CO2 dissolved in it, which stays in solution in some form. So it dissolves into bicarbonate and carbonate and creates H+ ions. That's a bit chemical now. It means essentially it gets more sour, it gets more acidic, right? So you create an acid, a carbonic acid, and you create essentially the ions promoting this. So this is a problem for organisms. They dissolve, they can't take it, they can't properly thrive, they can't properly do their photosynthesis. You want to protect them. This is no good, because those organisms are important. If it's algae, it's really important they take up the CO2. What you can do is actually two things. You can feed them with nutrients so they are happier. That's been done, didn't quite work, but it works for some areas. So what you can now do is basically give them an alkaline substance to make the pH right, to have them not acidifying, but to make them feel pH-wise well, to make them happy. And you can do that by grinding stones and throw them into water. Because there are some stones which naturally are weathered into water, like from the mountains, right? You have the weathering, and the weathering brings in some sort of ions, but you can also enhance this weathering. It's also called enhanced weathering, by just like artificially grind the stones, increase their surface and pour them into water. And then you can see if the organisms get happy or they should. But we don't know. So this is a promising approach, and there have been nice calculations and predictions done about it, which are very promising, and say you could protect ecosystems with this and enhance CO2 uptake, both chemically and biologically in the ocean, and make it export to the deep sea, so it's not our problem anymore for a couple of thousands of years, and cool down the planet if you're in a really good shape with this. But in the first place, you could stabilize the climate, right? And this is what, I mean, as I said, there were predictions, which are models, which are mathematical calculations, and that's fine. But no one really tried, and colleagues all over the world, together with us, and we are trying this. We are trying to establish a proper protocol for different ecosystems to find the right mineral for all the ecosystems that are endangered mostly, and to enhance this carbon pump, as you call it.
Through the grinding of rocks.
Through grinding of rocks.
Limestone or
so
something.
you literally take, limestone is one of the candidates. You take a stone, you grind it down to basically dust, right?
Trying not to burn CO2 as you grind it.
And now you try to be, it's a trade-off,
Yeah.
as you put forward. Yeah, it's a trade-off. You have to be careful, like not to put too much energy into the grinding. So you need to find a grind size that works well for your goal, but it doesn't cost too much of energy. And also you need to think about transportation, about mining for those minerals, things like this, right? You would have limestone as one example. There's olivine, there's calcite, there are a couple of other examples that are promising candidates. So one of my PhD students, Jakob, he's working on this right now and tries to establish a proper chemistry to balance pH values. And he's already identified a couple of good substances that work well without too much grinding. Though I think he secretly likes the grinding most of it. No, but Jakob does already the first parts of the project. He carried out the chemistry part, and we already identified potential candidates. Now we are trying them out on cultures to see how they impact
On what?
on cultures of algae and microbes,
Okay.
to see how they directly impact on life forms, on important primary producers that actually fix the CO2 from the atmosphere, that pull it out, and that's what he will start now. He kind of went on vacation, I don't know. I mean, maybe he comes back. But afterwards we can start our culture experiments, and this will be fantastic. Then we know if this really works in the sense of protecting the biology. It may also disturb them. We really don't know. It's only a prediction so far.
It's because of the diversity in biology on the Earth.
Yeah, you don't know it.
And what we've done already to kind of like mess up that diversity, and then.
Well, then we see it as our task to stabilize it again, right?
Yeah, we do, but
our job.
It doesn't sound like an easy task.
Well, it's not. If it would be easy, someone else would have done it already. It's not easy, of course.
Let's get a beer.
Let's get a beer. Cheers.
Cheers again.
That's a nice beer.
Carolin. That's delicious. Can you give me like an example of a Gaia feedback system where biology regulates the chemistry of Earth?
Well, essentially that was what we would have talked all the time about, which is the stabilization of Earth temperature. But there are smaller feedback cycles that you could possibly think about a bit easier. There's actually something called the claw hypothesis, which is a bit in competition with Gaia, but essentially, well, I often use it as a Gaia example because I look at it like this, which is the following. So imagine you're in the ocean and you're phytoplankton or a bacterium, you're a small organism, and you contribute to producing a substance, and the substance is called DMS, and DMS is a substance that evaporates, it diffuses out of the ocean and gets into the air. And if it does so, it makes clouds, because it's something called a cloud nuclei. So it's a core for making a cloud.
Water droplets can cling to this particle and then
exactly. So it's something that clouds form around. Those organisms do that, and the idea behind it is essentially that they do it to then more or less initiate this cloud formation to cool locally down the ocean. So to basically have a feedback between organisms and the atmosphere by cooling it down again. So this is a very, very nice idea. And it presupposes some sort of will of the organisms to do so, right? If they would feel hot or so, and then they produce the DMS, form a cloud, and the cloud cools down the situation there, and everyone is happy again. That's a bit of a simplistic picture, of course, but it's a nice illustration of how a feedback cycle would theoretically happen. So I've been working on a couple of feedback cycles myself, and one of the ones that I really liked was, or that I was really interested in and that I was happy to discover, was one in so-called oxygen minimum zones. This is where the ocean lost a lot of oxygen and actually became anaerobic again, which means there is no oxygen. So there's special life. What you have there is you have water coming up from the deep ocean, and it brings nutrients along, and those nutrients make a lot of other organisms being productive, or phytoplankton essentially doing primary production, that's how it's called. And this means essentially they draw out CO2 off the atmosphere and build up a lot of biomass. This biomass sinks down again and gets respired by other organisms because they eat it and essentially use all oxygen compounds up, and all the water becomes more and more anoxic. And this, because it's in the ocean and you have water movements, creates some sort of circle. It really is physically driven in a circle up again to the surface, and you enhance this effect more and more because low oxygen water favors this whole nutrient transport up, right? So you lose oxygen, you bring more nutrients to the surface. You get the system more productive. Material sinks down, you get less oxygen because it's respired all of this, right? And so it goes on. And my idea was that this has some sort of endpoint, because organisms then at a point everything becomes so anoxic that it produces some toxic substance. This always happens. And this substance is called hydrogen sulfide. This is produced then and kills off all life so that the whole system becomes unproductive, and also the nutrients don't promote this productivity anymore. So essentially you kill off the system, which leads then to less respiration also. So everything dies, right? So you don't have this anymore, that the oxygen gets respired away and the system can normalize again. So it is complicated to understand, but what it essentially means is that you would not expect the ocean to lose more and more oxygen as it has been predicted, but that life, because it's sensitive to low oxygen itself at a point and to toxic substances resulting from this, would die off and not be productive anymore, and you would normalize the situation again until it's okay and life can live again. So you would have rather an oscillation of situations, and this is also what we see over Earth history a lot. You have actually situations oscillate. You have CO2 going up, organisms become active, it goes down again. It comes to cold, it goes up again because organisms die, right? So it goes down again because they become active again. So you see this actually in a lot of examples. Another classic example, I think it's one of the Lovelock examples, is the salinity in the water. So the amount of salt that you have in the ocean, which should actually technically increase all the time because it's minerals flooded in from the earth, and they just basically get transported into the oceans via rivers or directly because they are washed off. So actually the salinity should increase all the time, but it doesn't. It doesn't, because there are some microbes and also little plants, phytoplankton, that produce substances that contain salts, and they then diffuse out of the water and go into the atmosphere, like methyl chloride or methyl iodide. And this keeps salinity constant. So life interacts with the biosphere, with the geosphere. So the biosphere interacts with the geosphere, and you stabilize the whole system with this, which is again a bit of a romantic thought, that it by purpose evolved like this, but it makes also sense, because if you have too much salt in the ocean, organisms die too. So there may have been a necessity to create this pathway to actually get rid of the salt actively by the organisms.
There are two beautiful examples about how Earth is a self-regulating system. But yeah, maybe the fact that there is life, self-regulation is an inevitability.
Yeah.
Not that they were actively searching for that Goldilocks spot, but like that's just the way it will happen in a complex system.
Yeah, it's probably how it has to happen. Otherwise, it would not become
Otherwise
complex,
we wouldn't
right?
be here talking about it.
Possibly. I believe you're having a point there. I mean, it must be somewhat like this to be able to develop life in that diversity that we know now. I mean, yeah, it's probably controversial though, as it always is.
And then you have the,
I mean, I believe like it must be like this. You can't have those huge fluctuations and have somewhat dependent bodies in this system thriving. We are dependent on the environment a lot, right? We need certain concentrations of everything, of oxygen, of whatever is in the air, whatever is in our nutrition. We need this. So you need to create a quite stable system already to evolve something like a higher animal. So this is only possible like this. Of course controversial, but this would be my take on it. So yeah.
But so your story about the oxygen minimum zones there, that's the first time I've heard a positive take on that, because
that's what I like to put forward about oxygen minimum zones. A lot of my research was about those waters in the ocean, right? You find them in the tropics mostly, and this is of course a good place to carry out research. And I loved it. So I traveled to all those exotic countries to measure the water columns, and this was a conclusion that I came to, and it was not a very popular conclusion. because essentially the models would predict a complete depletion of oxygen and stabilization in this oxygen depleted status, where only certain life can be and higher life can't. But I do not think this is right. And I believe this is a good example actually of some self-regulating feedback and of some feedback loop that actually stabilizes the system. And if it stabilizes the system, the Earth is a system. It's part of the Earth, so that works on any scale, I would believe. And of course, it kind of fed into what I always thought since I was an early student and worked on nitrous oxide. So it was all feeding into this, and possibly it just was what I want to see, but I'm just trying to explore it. I'm not saying it is the absolute truth. I try to figure it out essentially. And I have my one PhD student, Christian, and my other one, Pehang, working on those feedback loops in oxygen minimum zones essentially, and they help me with this and have their own thoughts, of course. And Christian put his own feedback ideas forward, which are not completely the same as mine, but interesting too. And so does Pehang. So we are trying to. Right now I have 4. Yeah. So this is a beautiful opportunity for me to interact with those people, because they're all very smart and probably can move that field way more forward than I could. So I'm lucky to have them. Of course, I hired them, so it's also a decision. But I hired them because I like their thinking. So they are very special people. And
the more people like you and your students that are working towards understanding these very, very complex things about how a planet,
sure,
how the biology on a planet interacts with the planet and vice versa. That's a very complicated thing, but the more closer we can get to understanding how it works as a whole, I think the more appreciation we would have for it.
Come on, it's so interesting.
It's
like
fascinating.
it's
absolutely fascinating.
It's the big question per se, I would say, how this works, and if this works like this, right? If this is a thing at all, that things self-regulate or not, this would be the biggest question to resolve. And well, as this is my basis, and I would be tempted to say, yeah, things should self-regulate to stabilize the planet. I developed those geoengineering projects on it because I think we are part of this, of life on Earth, right? And have to contribute to the self-regulation in a way. And we are a special type of life. We are the most novel one. We are the one that actually does by nature a lot of geoengineering by building houses and cultivating all the landscapes. So
that's how we got to where we are, to
sure,
geoengineer.
And we gained energy via uncommon and unusual and unpopular pathways, right? And messed up the atmosphere some bit. But this is only a very short episode in human evolution, so we may be able to reverse it. And this is actually part of evolution, I believe. So this is how I look at this.
In order to speak with an authority about the bigger picture, about how the world works, you need to understand the microorganisms. I think that's a beautiful story.
Absolutely.
And you know, you're a marine biologist. You were inspired to do marine biology whenever you were a 7-year-old girl looking through a jam jar down at the sea, looking at anemones.
Yeah.
You know. But
got to start from somewhere.
A lot of people that think about marine biology think, oh yeah, whales and dolphins. That would be a marine biologist.
Oh, that's what the classic thinking about it is. It's not, by the way.
Whales and dolphins, they're all fair enough. But what really makes the world go round is the microorganisms, especially those microorganisms in the ocean.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's the sexy part of marine biology.
Absolutely, you know? It's the biogeochemistry, the edge of life forms where you have life, just barely have life, and the chemistry essentially, right? That's what makes it. And we are some part of it, but essentially, I mean, this is what rules the world.
Yep.
I know this. There's this email signature that one of my students, Christian, sends always out, and it says like, "Who rules the world? It's microbes." It's always in his email.
The Beyonce song.
In a way, right? It is. In a way, it isn't. It's the basis, the fundamental regulation of the interaction between chemistry and life. But of course, the higher life has a extremely big role. And without this, we wouldn't have a stable atmosphere as we have, and without this, we wouldn't have a stable temperature. So how would that even work? So you need essentially all life. And you see those advertisements even of Greenpeace and other things that say like, oh, humans are the cancer of the earth. No, this is not how evolution works. It all belongs to the system. It's a complete ecosystem. You can't just remove the top species or like the human species or whatever species. You can't. It belongs together. It's one business. And if you remove one, you mess up the whole thing. And even if you remove the humans, you mess up the whole thing. It has to re-evolve, but it won't evolve possibly the same way. Maybe it would. But this is not how evolution works. And I'm always shocked by those weird advertisements and like that essentially make the humans the bad player here. This is not the right way to look into it. Of course there's some messing up, but there's also the potential to fix and to develop anything from there. And this potential is in the humans.
And that potential first and foremost comes with respect for nature and then the pursuit of knowledge.
Sure, I mean you need to establish that knowledge in the first place, but then humans can. Humans can understand, humans can be smart about it, humans can develop thinking. So I disagree. I just disagree with this whole notion of humans playing the worst part of this, and this is not the whole story and not the right way to look at it. It's not how you can look at the world.
Carol, you've been busy. You have a group. You've got 4 PhD students.
Not so busy.
Yeah.
There's always space for a beer. No, I'm busy.
Beer's also part of the plan as well. But
I'm busy. I'm happy to be.
What is next? What is on the horizon? What is the future plans for your work?
So I mean, it's obviously the projects that I have running span really everything, like from elaborating on more feedbacks to finding solutions for climate change problems, like everything.
Simple thing like finding a solution to climate change.
Simple things like
your day job.
Well, there are a couple of very skillful colleagues who help me with this now, who do the same, and I'm really a lucky person to be able to collaborate with the best people in the field. And as I said, I got this funding. This was a gigantic opportunity for me to develop that further, and I can actually really approach this symptom of climate change, which is ocean acidification, but also we, as a side effect, will take up more CO2 from the atmosphere with developing those methods with the grinded stones. And I find it wonderful. I also, I mean, as you already said, it's right, I already have a handful of PhD students, which is a big team. And if you really want to spend time with them and understand their thinking and develop, then it actually is a lot. Mm-hmm. But so I can actually even hire the same amount of people again, because I just was lucky, right? And had a good idea for projects. So I'm constantly hiring people now to develop the ocean negative emission technologies further, and to also understand feedbacks and to understand potential dangers before we upscale those applications, because a lot of people are now looking into upscaling this before we actually know what they are doing. So this is going to be a difficult thing. Mm-hmm. And I'm confident we will be good on this. And as I said, we already started our first experiments and
in the lab.
Yeah, in the lab, and found some promising approaches that we could possibly apply, and we will start applying it in Danish waters in Limfjorden, which is on Jutland, a nice fjord system which gets water inflow from the North Sea, struggles with deoxygenation, which means like it's actually losing oxygen at high rates in summer, but also it can be quite acidic, so we have a good environment that we in the first place can try to protect. And then we go to one of the major productive areas in the ocean, which is the Upwelling system of Mauritania, which is in the Atlantic. It's of Africa, right, around the islands of Cape Verde. Mm-hmm. It's a nice place to go again. It's one of the places I was at for many occasions during my master's and PhD time, and I have good collaboration there. And we will try how actually our approaches work in this system to then feed it into a model that we just will join together with all the working groups that are working on this globally. And this is located with my collaborators in Kiel, who just try to then find a global approach to where we apply the best strategy to make it happen and make the CO2 uptake brilliant and protect the biodiversity at the same time. I find this really fascinating right now.
I want to hear more about that collaboration between scientists.
You know how scientists are. It's all interesting people, right? You have those special persons. And by nature of our job system, it's all a competition in a way. But then again, I think there's a certain change right now happening, where people are really interested in such a profound way that they actually do not compete anymore, but rather collaborate because they are seeing shit is going down and we actually have to. Also, a lot of governments are able to and willing to put money into our different projects, so we actually get our funding from different sources. Denmark was willing to do so. Different foundations in Denmark were willing to do so. And I was in that sense again lucky because there were a couple of people who were very interested in this topic, and they may have been interested in this topic way before I was. One of those people is Leonard Bach, and I studied with that guy. We did our masters together and more or less our PhDs at the same institute, so we know each other since long. He went to Tasmania and has a junior professorship there, and just got promoted to a permanent position, which I think this is right. He is so good, and they are actually lucky to have him. And he's working on the same thing, but in the Southern Ocean, so we can nicely combine it, and we facilitate this by student exchanges, and so we are able to collaborate in a non-competitive sense to bring our results together. We have other collaborators at the main ocean institutes, like France has the IFREMER. We have a collaborator there who is interested in organisms that live on the sea floor. So this is not what I am doing. I'm working on organisms that live in the water itself. Bringing this together will be extremely important. We need to understand the whole ecosystem, but we are specialists on different scales. We have collaborators in Germany that are good at predicting what this will mean in the future. So this will be important. And then we have collaborators in Princeton where I had a guest professorship, and they are able to actually upscale it to the globe. So they will do this, which will be brilliant, because then we actually worldwide can say this is a good strategy for here, this is a good strategy for there. This will actually be a very nice network.
So in science there's a worldwide collaboration to try to improve.
That's at least the ideal that you would want to have, right? Yeah. It's not always real. But I think the younger generation is more developing towards it. And I'm really happy to be part of this. I don't see science as something which is a one-man or woman show. There's no point. It's science. It's first of all paid usually by the taxpayer, so it belongs to the public. And second, where's the point? We want to gain knowledge, so we create knowledge.
More knowledge together. I hope you enjoyed that episode of the Science and Beers podcast. If you have any follow-up questions about what was just discussed, please add a comment on one of our social media links, or feel free to send us an email at scienceandbeers@gmail.com. I will add a couple of links in the description so you can follow Carolin, keep updated with her work, send her a question if you want. Also, please consider supporting the podcast. It's currently run independently and voluntarily, and I've invested some money in equipment, as well as delicious Brooklyn IPAs. So your help would be appreciated. You can do that at patreon.com/The Science and Beers podcast. It would also be a great help if you were to recommend this podcast to a friend or leave a review. You can do that if you're listening on iTunes, for example. That would help us greatly to spread the word. Thanks a lot.